I think you're bringing up two interesting points. So the first is it seems like I mean we were talking about censorship earlier. What can we do in terms of addressing those sorts of issues? I think certainly all of us are having a conversation about probabilistic thinking, right? I think all of us are saying this is likely and that isn't likely, and that's the sort of conversation hopefully that we model. Because we make evidence to say that what we believe is false, and I think we should embrace that, right? But at the same time, it seems like replicability, and Bruce and I have talked about this before as well, right? As a cornerstone of evidence is that you want things to be replicable, and if you want things to be replicable, you need to have the thing to replicate in the first place. So if you hide the diamond, so to speak, you can't make a fake. So I mean, how do we? What are the things that we should be looking for? To me, it seems like what we should be looking for are, let's zoom out on mechanisms now. Look at process. So when we look at a study, right? You mentioned RCTs. Well, sure, there are many things you can do without RCTs, but maybe we can do an RCT, maybe with supplements or things like that, right? So it feels to me that it's a shame that these sorts of things might get hidden if bringing it to the limelight will either help add evidence, or maybe it was wrong, and we'll find out, but we can only find out if we try to replicate.
I absolutely agreed. Replication is fundamental, and we know there's so many retractions. I mean, you probably know about the, was it the JAMA? I think it was JAMA. No, the Lancet, 200-year history. And a week ago, they did the fastest retraction in their history, and it's turned into a debacle. I think it was a study around this hydrochloroquine that's become very political. And they and other journals published a study that used data from an American company, I forget the name, and it turned out that the data was complete bunkum. And the company was set up 4 months ago, and they can't really get through to the people who run the company. And basically the Lancet and other journals had to retract the paper within days. So yeah, there's a big problem with replicability, because they ran with data that was junk data, and they created a furore and embarrassed themselves worse than their 200-year history. I'm not sure why they published so quickly or what happened to the peer review process, but apparently the peer reviewers said, we didn't really look at the data reliability. We just looked at the study. So it's a big problem. In terms of replication, so we have 4 studies now, for instance, back to just the vitamin D example, there's 4 human studies and they all say the same thing, which is nice because they all came out within around a few weeks. So there's a lot of good people around the world doing this work. And there's one study that kind of conflicts. And like you say, it's important. Well, you got to look, why does it conflict? And when you look and you analyze their data, the data was based on levels measured 15 years ago. They were looking at whether or not you got infected, not really the severity of outcome, which is a completely different thing. So just to your point, when you look at a study that does conflict, you need to say, well, is this because the other 4 were somehow inexplicably incorrect? Or is it because this study is not doing the same thing? And it turned out it was the latter. But I'm not sure who is doing the work, though, of gathering these studies, comparing them, and trying to progress our thinking based on them. I mean, I'm doing it, but that's no good. You know, I mean, in fairness, what it's the, but are the authorities doing it? No, I think they're not really interested in it. Now, the other day in the UK, there was a front page news in 2 newspapers that the government has ordered a urgent inquiry into vitamin D and coronavirus, and it was front page of 2 newspapers. So I'd have to be fair and balanced and say, look, that's good to see. But like you said, we're going to have to see in the next few weeks, does it happen? Mm-hmm. You know, does it really happen? It's just a headline.
Yeah. Very interesting. And the other point that I want to broach with you is the other side of that. So when you said hypothesis, your hypothesis approach made me think of Darwin, who famously when asked if he wanted to marry, wrote down a sheet of paper and wrote down all the reasons for and all the reasons against. Kind of a silly example, but
the answer is no.
Fire to the greats, right? I mean, it seems though that one huge problem that I've seen from an educational perspective when you're trying to do a pro-cons list, and there's a lot of merit to it. So, but a problem that I've seen with many students is how you do this in a way that is not artificially trying to either create balance or artificially trying to create imbalance. So what do I mean? I mean, frankly, confirmation bias. So I worked a fair bit on kind of how do you communicate critical thinking. And the best part is almost all students will come in and they will say something about, they'll do a project on, I don't know, I'm not going to name projects, but they'll do a project on some topic, and the project will say, well, there's a lot of confirmation bias, but all the reasons why, and that will be in itself an exercise in confirmation bias, right? So how do we avoid that? I worry that it comes at a very young age, and so even our educational system, I think persuasive essays maybe should start a little bit later, and science and evidence-based thinking should start a little bit earlier. But anyway, that's controversial and something to be discussed. So when you're making your hypothesis list, though, I think there is always, even for the best of us, right? So this is not just a student's problem. It happens to me, I'm sure it happens to all of us. That is very easy to say. A while ago, I'll give a silly example. A friend and I were having a debate about Canon versus Nikon. So these are the two big camera companies of the past. Now it's all just all the cell phone companies. But so my friend had Nikon, and I was having Canon, and we wrote down these lists, and we wanted to argue for why our cameras were the best. And we used very much of the same evidence to argue that each of our cameras was best. And you look at that and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's clearly an example of confirmation bias that I think is part of making lists like this. So how, in your experience, have you tried to avoid that?
Yeah, confirmation bias it's just so enormous a problem. It's beyond my ken. And I have fallen for it. And I fell for it early in my career. And then I got wiser and I began to not fall for it. But even 25 years into my career problem solving, I found myself occasionally drifting dangerously close. I think there is only one way. And again, I don't want to make this too simplistic, like there's one magic solution, but in a sense, there's one central plank. You must strive to disprove your pet hypothesis. That is where your energy must go. Because if you strive to disprove your hypothesis, if it's valid, it will strengthen through that process. It will prevail. You know, it's like putting all these pups or something out into the wild. The strong will survive, but you've made a tough environment. You must strive to disprove your own hypothesis. And that's what I do. So it's the only way you can break out of that mold, because I find myself still, I believe the lockdown added very little over smart distancing. And I believe that from the start. We have the mathematics from all the professors that essentially proves it, but I look at their analyses and I say, where are they wrong? And then I look at my opponents who give evidence against it, and I dig into that and I look and I say, where am I wrong? What are we missing? It's the only way to do it. And if you can't, with honesty, genuinely trying to prove your hypothesis wrong, if you can't do it, you now have a reasonably firm hypothesis that you truly can call your pet hypothesis, but only because you genuinely tried to break it. Now, I don't mean pretending you tried to break it, like, oh, my hypothesis, I looked at the data from the other side and I don't agree and it's not convincing. I mean really try and break it. And that's an extremely rare thing out there, I have found. Maybe not in specialists, you know, like yourselves, but broadly speaking, all I see in cholesterol, the fat is bad theory, over-exaggeration of medicine benefits, this corona thing, lockdowns, it's always the same. People do the exact opposite of what I said. They will scrounge and dig, and they will dig up every morsel of supporting evidence. But any hypothesis you can gather supporting evidence. That's easy. And it's facile. You have to look for the evidence against and see, can you say, yes, that evidence is weak, and then acknowledge the evidence for your hypothesis is strong, but put that aside. The evidence against is weak, and by God, I looked with an objective mind. It's the only way, I think, to overcome cognitive bias. I'm not sure there's any other way. Bar the use of the 3 tools I told you. If you use those properly in the hypothesis for against, you're going to be doing what I said anyway. You're going to be agonizing about the against evidence for your favorite hypothesis. That's what will wake you up at night, is the against, not the for column. You got lots of evidence for. That's easy. It's the against evidence. Is there something there that will kill it? Only one bullet kills someone, right? Lots of bullets for. So only one bullet will take your whole hypothesis down, and it's dead. And you got to find that bullet. If it's not there, okay, maybe your hypothesis is right after all.
Very interesting. And I think it's maybe on all of us to be thinking about better ways of engaging in that search. Because like you said, it's very easy to do a half-hearted version of it. I mean, I think some things that we're starting to see emerge, not at all to the extent that I would like, but we're starting to see emerge in some of the data fields, is where if there's a way to dissociate the search for evidence from the hypothesis. So to give you an example, if I know, if I'm, let's say now arguing Mac versus Windows, right? Well, these are pet hypotheses, I'm not going to make any claims. But if I'm arguing for Mac versus Windows and I know something about what processors Mac have and what processors Windows computers are using, then I could say, oh, look, the processor for Mac is better or the processor for Windows is better. But what if I don't know? What if I didn't actually know? What if there was a way to scramble the connection between the processor and the computer, and now I have to evaluate these processes individually on their own merits? What if there was a way to scramble, and you were talking about very complicated systems, and like you said, these causal relationships are often not straightforward. It's not the standard cholera Jon Snow example where you go and you find the pump and you break that pump and you've discovered causality. It's oftentimes the things we're dealing with now are much more complicated. And that lends both benefits and downsides. And I think we've talked about Neil Ferguson's. So I think modeling has its purpose, of course. Otherwise, I would be telling myself I do nothing of use. But there's a sense in which modeling has a problem in that there's many bugs that you can find and there's many handles to pull. And oftentimes it's very easy to find the handle to pull that supports your hypothesis, right? So whenever you have these things with 15,000 parameters, it's very easy to pull the ones that support your hypothesis unless we can hide them from ourselves. So if I don't know, if you were saying the bullet, right? So if you can blind yourself from seeing the target when you shoot, then if the target is armor plated, the bullets won't hit it, and you just spray the bullets everywhere. But on the other hand, if I know where the target is, I could intentionally miss, right? So maybe there's tools like that we should be inventing and processes we should be inventing, and maybe one of those is the 3-step process. But it feels like a constant endeavor that we should all be focusing on is how do we search for problems with our own hypotheses more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways you can, if you truly are doing it right, you will take really good people and give them the role of finding contradictory evidence. If you're worried you yourself even trying to do what I described, that maybe you won't succeed, okay, well then give it to reputable top people with the brief. Here is the current hypothesis, and we really need to ensure that there's no evidence against it. So I want you to strive to find evidence that undermines this hypothesis. And I don't want you to talk to me while you do it, because I want to be hands off. I mean, that would be the ultimate. Yeah. But in the scientific process, usually you get an element of that, because you've got a bunch of experts who believe in hypothesis A, And then usually if they're incorrect in principle, there will be other experts who actually say it's B. And we've seen this over the centuries. Now, we have special challenges today because in the big ones, the B guys might end up getting their YouTube videos taken down, right? Or at very least, they'll be sidelined and taken off committees. So sorry to go back to that again, but it's a very real problem. But yeah, the solution would be, we mostly worked on multi-factor problems, massively multi-factor lots of times. And it was always a quality that at the end of the issue, you lost millions of dollars, but you realize we did solve it quickly. You know, whether it was 9 days or 10, you realize the massive complexity and you say, okay, we did a good job. But often in retrospect, the really complex 6, 7 subtly interacting factor problems that were sheer hell during them, where you had to use all the tools I mentioned, usually in retrospect, when you understand them now and you've been through the fire, you can actually summarize them quite eloquently. And they don't seem as complex as they were, but they were. And that's another thing. I think as we come out of this thing, which is multi-factor, more and more real world data will be there where you'll be able to say, this is what happened. And the modeling really will be completely defunct. It was a thing, a creature of its time. It was a creature created or born in a panic when coffins and refrigeration was seen and everyone had to use the precautionary principle. Of course, there's a potential for a lot of death and suffering. So you've got to err heavily on the side of conservatism. But afterwards, when you look back and you have the data, now you can put together the tapestry and say, so this is how it actually was. And in retrospect, realize, okay, we overshot. But the only thing stopping that now is pride, ego, politics, cognitive bias, and all the things we're talking about. There's a lot of forces to stop that happening. And what worries me is if we don't go through that process of the debrief that we always did after a big issue, we went through a debrief process where we went through the final hypothesis for against sheets, the final Kepner-Trago is not, the final root cause diagram. And we made sure we did the last step of cleaning those up in the final rev and taking learnings. We often spent maybe a whole half day in an offsite and we went through all the learnings where everyone was expected to be objective and acknowledge what we got wrong. We'd explore the hypothesis we spent a week on. We lost millions of dollars. That was wrong. What do we learn from that to not do it again? And my fear is with this one, that process of learning that's crucial to not repeat history, I'm not seeing it yet at all.
Well, perhaps we're still
Sorry to be a negative. I'm a bit of a bummer today, but I've been invested emotionally in this for 8 weeks now. I've interviewed professors and experts all over the world. I'm heavily engaged to the point of having bias myself. I'm aware of the danger, but I've also seen what I described to you. There's an ominous side to this going forward. I just think it's crucial. We need to use all the tools properly that you described or we talked about, and we need to properly analyze the situation and maybe do better next time. I mean, the damage that's been caused by the interventions, we need to learn by that really for the future of the world, I reckon. Sounds a bit melodramatic.
Well, here's to proving ourselves wrong.
Yeah. So I very much appreciated your time, Ivor, and I appreciated that you gave practical advice all along the way. Is there a final piece of advice, maybe a single sentence, that you would give to the layperson, the non-scientist, the ordinary member of the audience on how they can navigate the issues we've talked about today?
Whoa, that's a tough one, Bruce, because it is very difficult for the layperson, especially with an absolute onslaught of media and, chest-thumping politicians. I'd say the advice has always been, particularly for technical people who have a technical aptitude, is to dig in and search and look at the logic for yourself. Take off the media hat, take off the political message hat, and try and look to the data yourself and try and be analytical in your thinking and look at the facts and the logic around something. And a bit like we said earlier, try and look for contradictions, not conspiracies, not stupid stuff. Try and look for logical contradictions to what the major mainstream message is and explore it. Don't end up on the wrong websites, guys. We know where they are. But for instance, in this one, there's a lot of highly credentialed epidemiologists and virologists that have gone through the data on this. And yeah, they've been censored. They've been taken out of Google searches. But, you know, try and look for credentialed people who are saying something different. That actually occurs to me. That's a good bit of advice, because I don't want people to end up in the wrong place. And by God, there's wrong places out there. The internet is full of them. So try and look for credentialed people who are respected, experts, genuine, who are maybe saying something a little different, and then try and weigh up the data and evidence yourself. But the challenge is that applies to people of a technical bent. And no disrespect, and I'm not being patronizing, but the majority of people are not particularly technical. I hate to say it, but it's just a reality. You know, we're not all, you know, the best golfer in the world. We're not all the most amazing piano player, and equally, we're not all the most technical. But maybe find a technical person you respect and get them to do the exercise with you. Yeah. I'm rambling a bit. It's a hard question. There's not an easy answer.
But maybe there's processes, technical or not, that we can all agree on and walk through. You don't have
to. And maybe even that simple hypothesis for against sheet, anyone can fill one out and try and think of the evidence. Yeah, and even lay people. As someone very close to me who is very skeptical about, who follows conservative views hugely, rang me a couple of weeks ago and said to me, Ivor, is this thing is kind of messed up, is it? And I said, oh, have you been watching my videos? No, I never watch your stuff, right? And I said, well, how do you figure this then? Because this person is an accountant, not technical. I know they're not technical. They couldn't put a screw in a wall. So the person said to me, well, he says, it's just occurred to me that this is a big pandemic, and we did lockdowns very late when already it was all over the place, it appears. But I don't know anyone who knows anyone who died, or I'm not even sure I know anyone who knows anyone who was infected. So what kind of pandemic is it really? And I said, okay, that's a good observation for a non-technical person. I said 60% of Ireland's deaths are in care homes with very aged people. So that's one reason. And the other reason is many of the others are aged with comorbidities. So you're not really going to see too many. But I said, is that it? And he said, no, there's another thing. And I said, what? He said, well, I love going shopping, as you know, and now they've closed a lot of the stores. So there's mainly only grocery stores, supermarkets open. But because I love going shopping and I'm bored, I'm doing a lot of shopping in all the stores all over the place. And he said, I noticed that there's all ages of people there, including women and men, they're 60s, and they're stacking shelves and they're going around, they're not wearing masks. He said, none of them got sick. None of them in any of the stores. And I said to him, good job, because you just use pure logic to work out what I and technical experts around the world are trying to say using mathematics and R values and curves. Guy worked it out based on logic alone. So there is hope.
Interesting.
Well, thank you, Ivor. Very much enjoyed our time with you, and I appreciate what you're doing. So we will say goodbye from California to Ireland.
Yep.
Keep doing what you're doing. We are the Risky Scientists. Thank you, Ivor.
Goodbye.
Thanks for a risky conversation. I know what I said is controversial, but taking a risk, eh?
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.